Well, after all that, I'm going to start with a downer. We've got a lot of problems these days. How do we deal? You know, the American writer William Dean Howells had a suggestion. He observed that Americans love a tragedy as long as it has a happy ending. The problems aren't so happy. Join me as I hunt for some hope. First, the tough stuff. Now, I'll offer a few reports from across the political aisles that show real losses that lead to real grieving, even as tragedies to some are just passing events to others. They all show evidence of the human reaper bringing convulsive changes. One example. Right now, there are 10,000 to 100,000 species going extinct every year. Many are gone before we even know about them. There have been 1 million or more abortions each year in the last few years, with an increase by 10% even after the national ban in 2022, showing women clinging to their reproductive rights. A third example, a gruesome example, war. Massive deaths. Ukraine war and the Gaza war we know about in the news constantly, but you know, those are 2 of 42 violent conflicts going on. Plus, mounds of plastic, mounds of dead, desperate migrations of people around the world, terrible diseases, climate change, shortages of products that are increasing competition and prices, not to mention each person's own personal issues. Have a nice day. But you know what? For all those problems, the biggest problem may be in how we look at our problems. Take selective attention, for example. It has a lot of power, but it also produces some problems. First, the powers. Our brains do good work. You can do same. All of our brains do some good work. They solve problems through the power of selective attention. You can focus. Attention also gives us the capacity to think creatively. And with that mental gatekeeper, we have to make choices, of course, right? That includes the power to ignore. And thereby, we have some increase of problems. Because for some people, problems are too big to notice. Take, for example, big consumption, big material consumption. It has a lot of side effects. But if we get really normalized to it, it just becomes part of everyday life. Out of sight, out of mind. Or those who do notice their problems, the problems around us, it's so overwhelming to think about them that it's tempting just to look away. A second burden comes from the way Americans are so polarized. Americans have many different views. And there are 2 common responses to polarization. One is fighting, and the other is courtesy. They each have some advantages. Fighting allows us to see differences sharpened. You know, it's clear, at least. And with fighting, sometimes you win. You know, a lot of people like winning. But every time there's a victory, the other side says, I'll get you next time. So the only sure bet with fighting is more fighting. Now, how about courtesy? It's less destructive than fighting, and that's a good thing. But as with the local group One Small Step, maybe you've heard of them, they urge people to talk about they urge people of different views to talk about their lives, not their differences. And that leads to a kind of niceness of papering over the differences. Also, fighting and courtesy even add to the problems we have, because they reinforce the sense that the choices are sharp and absolute in contrast with each other. That leaves little room for listening across differences, much less learning from them. So there you have it. With overwhelmed attention, there's a tendency to say, what's the point? And with polarization, there's a tendency to say, absolute answers are bust. These are some of the burdens we have for dealing with our problems. Are there ways to turn our burdens, these challenges, into assets for addressing our many problems? I think so. But how? How to find strength in selective attention? Well, for one thing, no one is responsible for everything. No one can solve all problems. But each person can do something. This is a reminder of the old saying, think globally, act locally. You've probably heard that. But you know, when a lot of people think globally, they end up despairing globally. We're back to the problem. Tap your brain. Tap your selective attention. Try selecting locally. This reminds me that when I teach environmental history courses, I would almost always get a few students after the first class who would come up after the class and say, I'm so interested in this topic because I want to save the earth. To which I would say, that's great. I really admire your passion. But you know what? It's kind of hard to wrap your head around the whole earth. Got a river? Got a street? Got a particular problem that you can focus on? Because that will present specific opportunities to sink your teeth into and to be able to gain some initial successes, to be able to deal with those discouragements. Those provide toeholds that allow you to broaden out. Someone in the next town might say, hey, you were able to save that species. I wonder if we can too. Then you can begin to think globally and even act globally. By contrast, despair is a luxury. It's a luxury of the well-to-do. Because if you have the means, you can cushion yourself from the problems in touching your personal life. You might be sad. Oh, that's so sad that that's happened to those people. But it doesn't really affect you personally. Maybe you've heard of the radical environmental group Earth First. But you know what? The real radical step is thinking about how these big problems affect people personally. Local first. That's the real radical step. Then take on the whole earth. Okay, how about finding some resources within polarized differences? Well, the resources are right under our noses, really, if we're going to just avoid the temptation to look up our noses at those we disagree with. The conventional wisdom is that with polarization, the choices are either or. Boom, boom. But you know, each different view from each human being stems from that person selecting parts of experience that make sense to them or that they're living through, that they're walking through. The whole of experience is so much more complicated and downright wicked. Not morally wicked, but wickedly complicated. But a funny thing happens on the way to problems getting more complicated. That also means that there are more angles of entry for dealing with them. Now, I'm going to dare me, I'm going to dare to present the wicked difficulties of two wickedly difficult problems made worse by each polarized side thinking the worst of the others. The issue of abortion. Mention that and most people want to just run away. The politics of abortion presents pro-choice versus pro-life. Pro-choice people defend the rights of women. Pro-life people defend the rights of babies, right? News alert, we need both, right? Think beyond politics. There are countless opportunities to improve the lives of women and babies. They all face countless problems, and each is a locale for personal and social improvements. If we can just pay attention to the array of issues they're dealing with. Here's another wicked problem. Mention Israel and Palestine, and most people want to run and hide. The current politics grows from a century of conflict amplified by the tragedies of anti-Semitism and colonialism. When it seems the situation can't get worse, tomorrow's news or next month's events, and it does. Americans are behind the American policies that are funding lots of weapons of war and funding a lot of efforts to repair the destruction from those weapons. It's a loop. What is wrong with this picture? I suggest a practical idealism as a way to lift up the politics, not instead of the politics, but to give it a boost. Imagine with me, funding seeds for peace. Imagine funds for schools and playgrounds in war-torn areas, businesses and farms, restaurants, entertainment, marketing. Imagine if we would use our skills of making ads that would produce ads for thinking about the other side in more peaceful ways. Popular culture directed in these ways, arts, music, plays, comedy shows. Imagine if the performers would send barbs to each other instead of bullets. Joint religious services. Okay, maybe at first, with members of different faiths on different sides of the sanctuary. Okay. How about peace tourism, where people would walk the walk of what people on each side are experiencing in their everyday lives? You can probably think of more based on things in your own life that give you hope instead of making you angry. Now, you may think, that seems pretty idealistic, huh? Well, okay. I am an egghead, and you may think, eggheads look at the world through rose-colored glasses. To which I say, guilty as charged. And you know what? Idealism is just a word we give for stuff we like, right? I mean, we say things are ideal because they're stuff that we like. Also, ideals are resources. They serve as leavens, you know, like when you're baking bread, leavens to our politics. And this can start at any point. You don't have to wait for the conciliation to happen to be able to do something. You can imagine your opponents as gadflies instead of as enemies. Gadflies are kind of like teachers. See the resemblance? Gadflies annoy and prod to encourage you to notice things even if you don't like it. That's what gadflies do. Imagine this in the case of abortion. If pro-choice people could notice the genuine losses of life, of babies. If pro-life people could notice the burdens that are happening on women's lives. In the Middle East, if Palestinians could notice the cruelties of terrorism. If Israelis could notice the cruelties of occupation. Each of these very real truths does not negate the very real reality felt and lived on the other side. This can enable some shifting from abstract antagonism to practical action, even in small steps. It doesn't have to be a big stride. All I am saying, to channel John Lennon, but also to channel the book of Matthew, by the way, is give peace some time. Give peace some fertile ground. Give peace a way to grow. And with fractions of the funding needed for weapons of war, we could end the endless loops of violence with anger leading to violence, leading to anger and more violence over and over again. Instead, grow peace. Grow peace. So I've come full circle here with you. Yes, we have big problems, but we make them bigger with the burdens of distraction and fighting. If we could begin to look at problems locally, at least for starting points, if we could move beyond just polarized fighting, this can lead to some non-political upgrades on our politics, as I call it. I've done some research on this, and I invite you to check it out. I also invite the views of Abraham Lincoln, because he had ideas that support these very concepts. He said of public sentiments that they're more powerful than statutes and more powerful than official decisions. With public sentiments, nothing can fail, he said. Without public sentiments, nothing can succeed. Then I imagine Honest Abe tuning in and listening to the music of John Mayer. He didn't really, just, a historian letting you know that. He didn't really. But I imagine him listening to the music of John Mayer, waiting on the world to change. Maybe you know the song. And there's part of the song where Mayer sings that he sees everything that's going wrong with the world and those who lead it. Gosh, that sure sounds like despairing globally, doesn't it? Then I imagine Lincoln going up to Mayer and saying, John, can I have a word with you? You're waiting? You are waiting for the world to change? Really? How about trying to tackle some problems that are within your reach? How about trying to listen to someone you disagree with? You might find some surprises. Because in a democracy, sentiments don't grow by force. They grow by persuasion. And we don't need unanimity to bring about change. And paying attention to that person next to you who's paying attention to other parts of the world might help reveal why they have those ideas that seem so kooky. Now, to reap these improved fruits, start with the roots. Start with what you know. Start with where you live. Start with what you love. Get that right, and politics will follow. And with that, my fellow citizens, I conclude.